Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something truly fascinating. We're going to take a slow, deliberate look right into the macroeconomic heart of Bhutan. We've got our hands on a newly released, just incredibly comprehensive data set, the Bhutanese Productivity Accounts 2026. This report was put together by Bhutan's Ministry of Finance alongside Keio University. And let me tell you, it gives us an unprecedented window into the structural transformation of a country that has relied on a very unique, hydropower-led development model. If you're at all curious about how modern economies actually grow, how capital and labor interact over decades, or what happens when massive infrastructure investments collide with harsh geographic realities, well, you are in exactly the right place. Let's take our time, slow down, and really unpack this together. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Bhutan's recent recovery. 2. Unpacking productivity. 3. The hydropower engine. 4. The productivity paradox. And finally, 5. Future diversification. 7.2%. I just want you to hold that number in your head for a second. After a period of, pretty noticeable economic deceleration and those massive, profound shocks of the early 2020s we all remember, this single figure right here represents Bhutan's real GDP growth recovery in the year 2024. It's a really powerful indicator. It shows the economic engine is firing back up, and honestly, it completely sets the stage for everything we're about to dig into. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Bhutan's recent recovery, expanding beyond the 2023 slowdown. So looking at the data from 2019 to 2024, it tells a real story of resilience. Following a pretty pronounced slowdown back in 2023, where growth dipped down to about 4.5%, 2024 really marked a broad-based acceleration in economic activity. And what's crucial here is that this wasn't just some statistical blip. It was a systemic rebound. Notice how the recovery in 2024 wasn't isolated to just a single sector. Take a look at the highlighted rows here: manufacturing, construction, and hotels and restaurants. The post-pandemic surge in tourism absolutely fueled that hospitality sector, right? Meanwhile, an expansion in domestic demand really drove construction and manufacturing. So what we're looking at is a multi-layered recovery, one that's breathing broad-based life back into the domestic economy. Moving into Section 2, unpacking key productivity concepts. Let's open up that macroeconomic toolkit. To actually find the structural trends hiding beneath our GDP numbers, we need to look at specific inputs. First up is CLEMS. This is just a vital framework used by economists to analyze productivity inputs. Instead of just looking at raw output, the final number, the CLEMS framework forces us to look at the actual ingredients of the economic pie. That's capital, labor, energy, materials, and services. By breaking down production into these really specific categories, we can see exactly which inputs are driving growth and which ones are dragging it down. In a highly resource-intensive economy like Bhutan's, knowing exactly how energy and capital interact with labor is, frankly, absolutely critical. Next in the toolkit, we have QALY. That stands for Quality Adjusted Labor Inputs. I love this metric because it recognizes a simple reality. An hour worked by a highly trained engineer is economically very different from an hour worked by an unskilled laborer. QALY measures not just the raw headcount or just the total number of hours worked, but the skill, the experience, and the educational quality of the workforce itself. A highly educated workforce fundamentally shifts a country's entire economic potential. And as we'll see in a minute, Bhutan has made some really significant strides when it comes to labor quality. And finally, we arrive at TFP, Total Factor Productivity. Seriously, if you only take away one concept from this whole explainer today, make it this one. TFP is the ultimate gauge of long-term economic efficiency. It basically represents the magic in the economy, how well a country combines its capital and its labor to generate output. Look, if a country is just throwing more money and more bodies at a problem, well, that's just mere accumulation. But if they're innovating, if they're improving processes and working smarter, that shows up as TFP growth. It is the truest measure of sustainable economic progress. Okay, to set the stage for the major revelation coming up, we absolutely must contrast two very specific types of productivity. On the left side here, labor productivity. That's how much output is generated for every hour a person works. Pretty straightforward. On the right side, we have capital productivity. This is how much output is generated for every unit of monetary investment, like building a new factory or, say, a massive hydroelectric dam. Now, a healthy economy ideally sees both of these rising together. But when they diverge, when they start moving in opposite directions, that signals a deep structural anomaly. Which brings us right to Section 3, the hydropower growth engine. This is Bhutan's capital-intensive core. So get this. From 1990 all the way to 2024, Bhutan's capital input grew by an astonishing 9.0% annually, every single year. This massive, continuous accumulation of capital is almost entirely tied to the harnessing of the country's rivers. Let's trace the milestones of this development, because hydropower growth isn't a smooth curve. Economists actually call it lumpy growth because it relies entirely on the completion of massive, discrete mega-projects. It all started with Chuka back in 1986. That was followed by the massive Tala project in 2006, and then Mangjakchu in 2019. Most recently, and this is absolutely crucial for the 2024 data we're looking at today, the first 2 units of the PHPA-2 project were successfully synchronized to the national grid in December 2024. These are massive, lumpy injections of capital that literally alter the country's economic baseline overnight. Just notice the blue and orange sections right here representing the pre-democratization era, so from 1990 to 2008. Look at that. Nearly 28% of all economic growth in Bhutan during that period came purely from the hydropower sector and the construction required to build it. Over a quarter of the entire nation's growth was generated by this single, incredibly dominant engine. And that leads us into Section 4, Bhutan's productivity paradox. This is really the climax of the BTPA 2026 data. We've firmly established that massive capital growth, right? But when we apply our macroeconomic toolkit to the numbers, a glaring contradiction emerges. Let's unpack this paradox clearly. When you look at the workforce, Bhutan is a regional superstar. Labor productivity has grown by a remarkable 5.3% annually since 1990. That is the absolute highest in the entire South Asian region. The workers look incredibly productive. But then you look at the other side of the ledger. Capital productivity has plummeted by 2.7% annually. That's the steepest decline in the region. So the efficiency of Bhutan's massive capital investments is dropping sharply, even as its labor metrics are soaring. It's a literal paradox. And remember TFP, total factor productivity, that measure of overall economic efficiency we talked about earlier? Over the entire 34-year measurement period, from 1990 to 2024, Bhutan's average annual TFP growth is exactly 0.0%. It has completely, totally stagnated. Compared to regional peers, there's a massive gap. In fact, Bhutan lags up to 2.0 percentage points behind India in long-run efficiency growth. What this tells us is that Bhutan is accumulating a ton of capital, and it's improving its labor quality through education, but it is not combining those two things more efficiently. So, the big question, why is this happening? Well, the 2026 report details the specific, pretty harsh realities that are dragging down capital productivity. First off, there have been severe delays in the massive PHPA-1 and PHPA-2 mega projects. This means billions in capital essentially sat idle for years and years without generating a single watt of electricity. Second, there are consistently rising construction and labor costs. And third, Bhutan is simply running headfirst into the limits of nature. Future hydropower development faces increasingly challenging geographic and engineering conditions. Bottom line, it is costing way more money to build infrastructure that is taking much longer to actually finish. So, here is the crucial point. You might logically assume that having abundant, incredibly cheap hydropower would automatically create a massive advantage for other domestic industries, right? But looking at the recent data from 2019 to 2024, that just hasn't happened. Notice the highlighted rows here. TFP growth in manufacturing and other tradable non-electricity sectors remains astonishingly weak. The cheap electricity is simply not translating into broad efficiency spillovers for the rest of the economy. In fact, the report states this explicitly, and it's absolutely worth reading with emphasis. Quote, affordable domestic electricity supply has not automatically translated into broad productivity improvements in non-electricity industries. Why is that? A major factor is winter electricity shortages. During the winter months, river flows decrease significantly, right exactly when domestic heating demand spikes. This mismatch creates huge supply constraints and reliability issues. It makes it incredibly difficult for energy-intensive manufacturing to confidently set up shop and expand their operations. All right, moving to our final segment, Section 5, Future Outlook and Diversification. Let's look at the 13th five-year plan. So how does a nation solve this deeply entrenched macroeconomic puzzle? Well, first we have to look at this rather alarming projection regarding those winter shortages. Back in 2024, winter electricity imports stood at just 3.4% of export levels. Pretty manageable. But due to soaring domestic demand, and yes, that includes demand from energy-hungry data centers, combined with naturally lower winter water flows, the report projects that by 2026, winter imports could skyrocket to 95.1% of export levels. Think about that. The structural limit of relying solely on run-of-the-river hydropower is visibly manifesting right here in these numbers. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute necessity to pivot. The data unequivocally shows that Bhutan must diversify. Now, the paths forward identified in the report are fascinating. Instead of relying purely on traditional heavy manufacturing, which as we know requires massive, stable 24/7 power that Bhutan struggles with in winter, Bhutan can leverage its cheap energy for the digital economy. We're talking about focusing on telecommunications, digital technologies, and actively participating in the international fragmentation of computational tasks, things like processing for artificial intelligence. If Bhutan can integrate itself into the global digital supply chain, it can completely bypass its traditional geographic constraints. As we wrap up this deep dive into the 2026 productivity data, I want to leave you with this critical question. Can Bhutan successfully pivot from a model of pure hydropower-led capital accumulation into a structurally diversified, digitally integrated economy? The data shows the absolute necessity of this transition if they want long-term survival and true total factor productivity growth. It's a monumental challenge, no doubt about it. But understanding these numbers, that's the very first step toward achieving it. Thank you so much for walking through this macroeconomic explainer with me. Keep questioning the data, and I will see you next time.